My brother always had this golden boy image. You know the type, straight A student, star quarterback, landed a six-figure job right out of college. Meanwhile, I was the screw-up in the family, the one who couldn't seem to get his life together. At least, that's the story my parents and brother told themselves. It didn't matter what I did. If I landed a new job, they'd roll their eyes and ask, "How long will you last this time?" If I bought something nice, they'd ask, "How did you afford that?" My brother, Ethan, loved to brag about how he had it all together and never missed a chance to rub it in my face, but things took a turn when Ethan decided to hire a private investigator. Yeah, you heard that right. A private investigator. At first, I didn't know about it, but apparently, he wanted to dig into my life to expose what a loser I was. Why? I'm still not entirely sure. Maybe he wanted proof to back up the snide comments, or maybe he just wanted to feel even more superior. Whatever the reason, Ethan went all in on his little scheme. Now, I didn't realize anything was going on until one day when I got a text from him. It was unusually friendly, like, out of character friendly. He said something like, "Hey, hope everything's going well. Let's grab lunch soon." Ethan hadn't voluntarily asked to hang out with me since, well, ever. I immediately knew something was up. I wasn't wrong. A week later, during a family dinner, Ethan casually mentioned that he'd heard some things about me. He said it with that smug little smirk of his, the kind that made you want to slap him. Then he started asking all these pointed questions. Still hopping between jobs? Must be exhausting. Or, so you're still renting, huh? Ever think about saving for something more permanent? I played it cool. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing me squirm. What he didn't know was that his little plan to expose me was about to blow up in his face. You see, about 3 years ago, I started working on a side hustle. I didn't tell anyone about it, mostly because I didn't want the constant judgment or unsolicited advice. It started small, a website selling handmade products. I spent hours learning the ins and outs of e-commerce, marketing, and customer service. Slowly but surely, it started to take off. What Ethan didn't know was that, over time, my little side hustle had turned into a full-blown business. And not just any business. I'm talking 7 figures. Yeah, I was raking in millions, but I kept it under wraps. I still lived modestly, drove the same car I'd had for years, and didn't flash my success around. Why? Because I wanted to succeed on my terms, without my family's interference. So, when Ethan's private investigator started digging into my life, he stumbled upon something that absolutely floored him. Instead of uncovering dirt about how broke or unsuccessful I was, the PI discovered my business empire. My company was registered under a different name, so it wasn't immediately obvious it was mine. But with a little digging, the PI pieced it together, and that's where things got really interesting. Ethan had hired this investigator to humiliate me, but now he was the one holding a bombshell piece of information he wasn't sure how to handle. Did he admit he hired someone to dig into my life? Did he confront me with what he'd found? Or did he just pretend none of this ever happened? Well, Ethan being Ethan, he chose the most awkward route possible. A week after the family dinner, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my living room. I raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He paced around for a minute before blurting out, "Why didn't you tell anyone you were doing so well?" At first, I pretended not to know what he was talking about. Doing well? What do you mean? He stared at me, his face turning red. Don't play dumb. I know about your business. I leaned back on the couch, trying to hide my grin. Oh, that. Yeah, it's been going all right. All right, he nearly shouted. You're a freaking millionaire, and you didn't think to mention that to anyone. I shrugged. Didn't think it was relevant. Besides, you all seemed pretty convinced I was a failure. Why spoil the narrative? The look on his face was priceless. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't have a snarky comeback. He just stood there, shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to say next, but trust me, that was only the beginning. Things were about to get a whole lot messier. Ethan stood there, slack-jawed, looking like someone had yanked the rug out from under him. He was the golden boy, the successful one in the family. I wasn't supposed to win. And now, here I was, calmly sitting on my couch while his brain scrambled to process the idea that I was worth millions. I could see the gears turning in his head, but what came out next still surprised me. So what exactly do you do? Like, what is this business of yours? Now, normally, I wouldn't have entertained his curiosity. After all, this was the same guy who had spent years tearing me down. But part of me couldn't resist rubbing it in just a little. Well, I said, leaning forward with a casual shrug, it started as a small e-commerce site for handmade goods. I made a few things myself at first, but then I partnered with other creators. We expanded, got into dropshipping, and eventually, I started designing my own branded products. It's not just one store anymore, I've got a portfolio of them. Oh, and I run an online course teaching others how to start their own shops. Ethan blinked at me like I was speaking another language. You teach people how to do this? Like, they pay you for that? Yep, I said, trying not to smirk. It's a whole industry. People want to learn, and I've got the experience to teach them. My courses are in high demand. He flopped down in a chair, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. And you just never thought to tell anyone? Not even mom and dad? Why would I? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You guys have spent years treating me like a screw-up. Do you think I wanted to hear, oh, but you should do it this way, or are you sure that's sustainable? I wanted to build something without the peanut gallery chiming in every step of the way. Ethan didn't have a response to that. Instead, he just sat there, stewing in his own discomfort. I could tell he was dying to ask more questions, but he didn't know how to phrase them without admitting how wrong he'd been about me all these years. But then, things took a turn I didn't expect. So, are you hiring? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. I actually laughed out loud. Are you serious? You want a job? He glared at me, his cheeks flushing. I'm just saying, if you're doing that well, maybe there's a role for me. I've got skills, you know. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Oh, I know. You've told me about your skills for years. But let me ask you something, why would I hire someone who spent most of his life looking down on me? What exactly would you bring to the table? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and saw a notification from one of my business apps. Another sale. $8.79. The timing couldn't have been better. I picked up the phone, casually showed Ethan the notification, and said, that's from one store. Just so you know, I don't really need help. He looked like he might explode, but he managed to keep it together. All right, fine. You've made your point. But what are you going to do about mom and dad? They are going to freak when they find out. Now, that was something I hadn't fully considered. My parents had always favored Ethan, not necessarily because they loved him more, but because he was easier to brag about. He had the flashy job, the fancy car, the big house. Meanwhile, I was the disappointment. I wasn't sure how they'd react to finding out I'd been quietly crushing it all this time, but then again, part of me couldn't wait to see their faces. Why do they need to find out? Just, tilting my head. You've kept secrets from them before. Why not let me have this one? Ethan shook his head. No way. This is too big to keep under wraps. It's only a matter of time before they find out, especially if they start asking questions about why I hired a PI. I laughed again. Oh, so you're worried about your secret getting out. Got it. He didn't deny it. The next family dinner rolled around a week later. I wasn't planning on bringing up my business, but I had a feeling Ethan might try to stir the pot. Sure enough, the moment we sat down, he launched into a carefully rehearsed speech. Mom, Dad, he started, putting on his best responsible son voice. Did you know Alex has been working on a business? A really successful one. My mom's fork froze midair, and my dad leaned back in his chair, looking confused. What kind of business? My dad asked, glancing at me. I gave Ethan a warning look, but he ignored it and kept talking. He's running an online empire, apparently. Multiple stores, courses, the whole deal. He's doing really well. Like, really well. For a moment, the table was silent. Then my mom asked, why didn't you tell us, Alex? I shrugged. Because you all seemed to enjoy the narrative that I was a failure. I figured, why ruin it for you? That didn't go over well. My mum looked hurt, my dad looked annoyed, and Ethan just sat there, probably enjoying the chaos. But then my dad asked a question that really caught me off guard. How much are you making? I hesitated. I didn't want to brag, but I also didn't want to downplay it. Enough, I said finally. Ethan couldn't resist chiming in. Try millions. That's what the PI found, anyway. The PI. Ethan had just outed himself. My mom's head snapped toward him. The PI. What PI? Ethan's face turned bright red. Oh, well, I couldn't help myself. Oh, you didn't tell them? Ethan hired a private investigator to dig into my life. He wanted proof I was a failure. Instead, he found out I was doing pretty well. The room went dead silent. My dad's face turned stone cold, and my mom looked like she was about to cry. Ethan tried to stammer out an excuse, but it was too late. Things were about to get really messy. The silence at the table was suffocating. My mom set her fork down slowly, staring at Ethan like he'd just admitted to kicking a puppy. You hired a private investigator to spy on your brother. Her voice cracked, like she couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. Ethan fidgeted in his seat, his bravado completely gone. It's not like that, he stammered, holding up his hands defensively. I thought maybe he was in trouble or hiding something, and I wanted to help. I snorted so hard I nearly choked on my drink. Help? Really? Is that what you call it? Digging through my life to find dirt on me so you could feel superior? Ethan shot me a glare but didn't deny it. My dad leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his glass. So let me get this straight, he said in a low, angry voice. You spent God knows how much money hiring someone to investigate your own brother, just so you could embarrass him. Is that what I'm hearing? It wasn't like that. Ethan insisted, his voice rising. I was trying to what? My mom interrupted, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. Humiliate him. Prove some ridiculous point. Ethan, what were you thinking? Ethan looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I just thought, he trailed off, his words dying in his throat. For once, he didn't have a slick response or a clever excuse. I decided to twist the knife a little. And the best part? Your little plan completely backfired. Instead of proving I'm a loser, all you did was prove how petty you are. My mom turned to me, her expression softening. Alex, why didn't you tell us about your business? Why keep it a secret? I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Because it didn't matter what I did. You all had already decided I was the family disappointment. I could have told you about my business years ago, but I didn't want to deal with the judgment or the skepticism. I wanted to build something for myself, without anyone's opinions weighing me down. My dad looked genuinely uncomfortable, like he didn't know how to process what I was saying. We never thought you were a disappointment, he said, but it sounded half-hearted, really. I countered, raising an eyebrow. Because every time I tried something new, the first thing I got was criticism. Or doubt. Or sarcasm. You all made it pretty clear what you thought of me. My mom looked like she might cry, and for a split second, I felt a pang of guilt. But then Ethan piped up again, and the moment passed. Okay, fine, he snapped, throwing his hands in the air. Maybe I messed up. But you're not exactly innocent here, Alex. You've been sitting on all this money, living this whole secret life, and you didn't even think to share it with your own family. I laughed, shaking my head. Why would I share it with you, Ethan? So you could find a way to belittle it. Or take credit for it. No thanks. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mom and dad exchanged a look, and then my dad cleared his throat. All right, he said, his voice firm. Enough. This has gone far enough. For a second, I thought he was going to rip into Ethan some more, but instead, he turned to me. Alex, I think you owe us an explanation. If this business of yours is really doing as well as Ethan says, then we deserve to know more. This is a big deal. I bit back a sigh. Of course, now that they knew I wasn't a failure, they suddenly wanted all the details. Fine, I said, folding my arms. What do you want to know? How much money are we talking about? My dad asked bluntly. Dad, my mom scolded, but he ignored her. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to just rip off the band-aid. Last year, my stores brought in about $6.2 million in revenue. After expenses, taxes, and everything else, I cleared just over $2 million. The room went dead silent again. My dad blinked like he hadn't heard me right. My mom's jaw actually dropped. And Ethan? He looked like someone had punched him in the gut. You're kidding, my dad said finally. I shrugged. Why would I joke about that? Ethan muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't quite catch it. My mom finally found her voice and asked, so what do you do with all that money? I mean, you don't seem to live extravagantly. That's the point, I said. I reinvest most of it back into the business. I don't need a fancy car or a giant house to feel successful. I'd rather build something sustainable. My dad nodded slowly, like he was starting to understand. Well, I'll be damned, he said. You've been building an empire right under our noses and we didn't have a clue. My mom reached across the table and took my hand. Alex, I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry we made you feel like you couldn't share this with us. I'm so proud of you. Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. But before I could respond, Ethan decided to make one last attempt at salvaging his ego. All right, fine, he said, his tone defensive. You've got your little business empire or whatever. But let's not pretend you're perfect, Alex. You kept secrets. You shut us out. That's not exactly something to be proud of. I stared at him for a long moment, then said, you're right, Ethan. I did keep secrets. But maybe if you'd been a little more supportive, I wouldn't have felt like I had to. That shut him up real quick. By the end of the night, the tension had mostly died down, but I could tell things would never be the same. My parents seemed genuinely interested in learning more about my business, and I could tell they were starting to see me in a new light. Ethan, on the other hand, was a different story. I don't think he could handle the fact that his loser brother had completely outshined him. But honestly, that wasn't my problem. Little did I know, though, this was only the beginning of the chaos. After that dinner, things got complicated. My parents were trying to make up for lost time, bombarding me with questions about my business and acting like they'd been my biggest fans all along. It was a little overwhelming, but part of me appreciated the effort. At least they were finally showing some interest. Ethan, on the other hand, wasn't taking things well. The guy was clearly spiraling. He'd gone from being the family's golden child to living in my shadow practically overnight, and it was eating him alive. The cracks really started to show a couple of weeks later. My parents invited me over for another family dinner, just me this time. No Ethan. I didn't think much of it until I got there and saw the look on their faces. Alex, my mom started, wringing her hands nervously, we need to talk about your brother. Here we go, I thought, what about him? I asked, already bracing myself for whatever drama was about to unfold. My dad leaned forward, his expression unusually serious. He's been acting strange lately. Defensive. Snappy. I think he's having a hard time adjusting to everything. Adjusting? That was putting it mildly. Ethan had spent his whole life being the winner of the family. Now that the narrative had flipped, he didn't know how to handle it, and I said, keeping my tone neutral, and my mom continued, we're worried about him. He seems resentful. Toward you. I laughed bitterly. You don't say. What gave it away? The part where he hired a PI to dig into my life, or the part where he tried to throw me under the bus at dinner? My mom winced and my dad sighed. Look, Alex, he said, I'm not saying what Ethan did was right. It wasn't. But he's your brother. Maybe you two need to have a real conversation about this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A real conversation. Dad, Ethan has spent years tearing me down. He couldn't handle the idea of me succeeding, so he went behind my back and tried to humiliate me. And now you want me to play therapist for him? Alex, my mom said softly, he's struggling. You know how competitive he is. This is hard for him. I shook my head, completely floored. It's hard for him. What about me? Do you have any idea how hard it was to build what I did while constantly feeling like the family screw-up? I'm not the one who needs to apologize here. My parents didn't seem to know how to respond to that. After an awkward pause, my mom finally said, "Just think about it, okay? Maybe talk to him. For the family's sake." I left feeling more frustrated than anything. Why was it my responsibility to fix things with Ethan? He was the one who'd been a complete jerk, not me, but as much as I didn't want to admit it, I knew they were right about one thing: Ethan wasn't going to let this go, and I was right. 2 days later, I got an email from Ethan. It was short, cold, and straight to the point. "Alex, if you're really serious about family, prove it. Let me buy into your business. I can help you grow it even more. You're sitting on a goldmine, and I have the skills to take it to the next level. Let's work together, Ethan." I stared at the email, equal parts amused and annoyed. The audacity of this guy. He couldn't stand the idea of me being successful on my own, so now he wanted to swoop in and take credit for my hard work. "No chance." I replied just as bluntly, "Ethan, I appreciate the offer, but my business is doing just fine without you. If you're serious about working together, maybe start by apologizing for hiring a PI to spy on me." "Alex," his response came back within minutes, "Alex, that's ridiculous. I was just trying to look out for you. If you're going to let your ego get in the way, that's on you. Don't say I didn't offer, Ethan." I didn't even bother replying, but apparently, Ethan wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, he started dropping little comments to our parents about how I was lucky to have stumbled into success and how I could use someone with his expertise to make it even bigger. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for the message to sink in. One day, my dad called me out of the blue. "Alex," he said, his tone carefully measured, "I've been thinking about what Ethan said." "About what?" I asked, already dreading where this was going. "About him joining your business," my dad said. "He's got a point. He has a lot of experience and maybe he could really help you. It might be good for both of you." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Dad, no offense, but you don't know the first thing about my business. Ethan doesn't either. He doesn't care about helping me. He just wants a piece of the pie." "That's not fair," my dad said, sounding defensive. "He's trying to mend things with you." "Is he?" I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's just trying to take advantage of the situation. He hasn't apologized. He hasn't taken responsibility for what he did. He just wants in because he can't stand the idea of me being more successful than him." There was a long pause and then my dad sighed. "Just think about it, Alex. That's all I'm asking." I hung up the phone feeling more frustrated than ever. Ethan had spent his whole life being the golden boy, and now he couldn't handle the fact that I'd outshined him. But instead of owning up to his mistakes, he was trying to weasel his way into my success. Well, if he thought I was just going to roll over and let him, he had another thing coming. Little did I know, though, Ethan wasn't done playing dirty. It started small, things I barely noticed at first. A weird spike in negative reviews on one of my biggest stores. Some posts on forums accusing my brand of shady business practices. A sudden influx of refund requests that didn't match the usual customer behavior. I brushed it off as normal hiccups in running a business. Things happen, right? But then, one day, I got an email from one of my suppliers. "Hi Alex, we've been contacted by someone claiming to represent your business. They asked for copies of our contract and payment details. Can you confirm this is legitimate?" I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't asked for any of that, and I sure as hell hadn't sent anyone else to do it. I replied right away, telling them to ignore the request, but something about it didn't sit right with me. That's when I started digging. Over the next week, I uncovered a trail of breadcrumbs that all pointed to one person, Ethan. He'd been contacting my suppliers, pretending to represent me. He'd been planting fake reviews online, trying to tank my reputation. And, worst of all, he'd actually set up a competing website, using a knockoff version of my branding and products. I was furious. I mean, it was one thing to be petty or jealous, but this was next-level sabotage. I couldn't believe my own brother was trying to destroy everything I'd worked so hard to build. So, I did what any rational person would do. I gathered receipts. Screenshots, emails, timestamps, everything. If Ethan wanted to play dirty, I was ready to outsmart him, but before I went nuclear, I decided to confront him. I wanted to see if he'd admit to what he'd done. I called him up and asked him to meet me for coffee. He sounded suspicious but agreed. When I walked into the cafe, he was already there, sipping his overpriced latte and scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. I sat down across from him, pulled out my laptop, and opened the folder of evidence. "So," I said, cutting straight to the chase, "how's the knockoff business going?" Ethan froze, his face going pale. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying and failing to sound innocent. I tilted the screen toward him, showing him the screenshots of the fake website, the emails to my suppliers, and the forum posts he'd written. "Care to explain this?" He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "Don't play dumb, Ethan," I snapped. "I've got all the proof I need. You've been trying to sabotage me." "Why?" "Because you couldn't handle the fact that I succeeded without your help." He glared at me, his mask of composure slipping. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" he spat. "You sit there all smug, acting like you're some self-made genius. You got lucky, Alex. That's all this is, luck." "Luck?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think building a multi-million-dollar business from the ground up is luck? While you were out partying and bragging about your six-figure job, I was working 16-hour days. I earned this, Ethan. Every penny. And now you're trying to take it away from me because your ego can't handle it." He didn't respond. He just sat there, seething. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Here's the deal," I said, leaning in. "You're going to shut down that fake site. You're going to stop contacting my suppliers. And you're going to stay the hell out of my business. If you don't, I'll take legal action. And trust me, Ethan, I've got more than enough to bury you in court." His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You wouldn't do that. Mom and Dad would lose their minds if they found out you took your own brother to court." "Try me," I said, my voice deadly calm. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Finally, Ethan broke eye contact, looking down at the table. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll back off." But I wasn't done yet. "And one more thing," I added. "You're going to apologize. To me. To Mom and Dad. For everything." He scoffed. "You're dreaming." I shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if you want any chance of salvaging your relationship with the family, I'd think about it." I left the cafe without another word, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Ethan might have backed down for now, but I knew this wasn't over. Sure enough, a week later, my parents called me, saying Ethan had confessed to what he'd done. He spun it as a moment of weakness, blaming the pressure of always being the golden child. My mom was sympathetic, of course, and my dad was just relieved we hadn't gone full scorched-earth.as for me. I didn't care if Ethan apologized or not. I'd built my success without his support, and I sure as hell didn't need his approval now. But if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that success doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes how people treat you. And sometimes, the people you thought you knew best turn out to be the ones you can't trust at all. Ethan and I still talk occasionally, family events, birthdays, that kind of thing. But it's different now. There's a wall between us that wasn't there before, and I'm not sure it'll ever come down, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Because at the end of the day, I've got my business, my freedom, and my self-respect. And that's worth more than anything Ethan or anyone else could ever take away from me.